In Part 1 we learned that the themes of the narration were the moral values and to glorify the ancient Athenians. We also found out that to locate Atlantis, we need to answer a lot of questions to satisfy the elements of the narration's plot. One of those questions is, how could a civilization pop up from nowhere and go away after a long period of time without leaving any trace around the area designated for it? We learned also that we should be aware of the fact that there are different interpretations for the names and descriptions used in the story, like, the Pillars of Heracles, because the narration was told and retold over thousands of years. Let us look for a place on the map that may qualify for civilization like that of Atlantis to flourish. Because civilization doesn't sprout out of the blues like weeds. It is a process that needs time and certain circumstances, particularly, for people just coming out of the caves, at that time. About 10,000 to 12,000 BC, or maybe earlier. An area for primitive people to settle down and have secure natural borders that allows them to defend themselves against wild animals and other human groups and live for a long period of time. In such a safe area they probably discovered agriculture, and learned how to make boats and engage in a kind of simple trade. They probably had fights and wars across the rivulets that separated their island for a while. However, the Nile flood and the shifting of land after the flood prompted these communities to react. They had to use their brain, and they had to communicate and cooperate. These loose communities probably lived in makeshift huts, then developed into villages and cities. That led to understanding the needs and feelings of each other, and that led to developing consciousness, empathy and sense of humanity. These are the seeds of civilization. They were probably the first people to make paper from papyrus, which grew naturally in the Nile Delta. Papyrus was a very important element in learning and developing a great civilization. It was the perfect means for communication, planning, drawing diagrams and maps, calculations and inventory, making sandals and furniture, and even making boats. It looks like the Nile Delta has provided favorable conditions for the civilization process. The human species who moved out of East Africa to the Nile Delta found it suitable to stay there for quite a long time. It looks like Homo erectus stayed there for about 100,000 years before some of them continued their trek out of Africa. They were followed by Homo sapiens. Those of them who reached the Nile Delta stayed there probably 60,000 years before some of them moved east. This is a map from Britannica showing Homo sapiens were in Africa from about 200,000 years ago before they appeared in West Asia at about 100,000 years ago. The Nile Delta is a very vast fertile expanse of land for groups of few families who drifted north with the Nile's flow. This is a 19th-century map showing how the Nile branches and lakes formed a lot of island in the delta. And this is a map showing how the coastline was off the modern coastline by many miles. And the whole delta was below the current sea level by more than 100 meters. The river branches divided the delta into isolated islands. The rivulets and canals formed natural borders for the groups of hunter-gatherers who settled in the delta. And it allowed them to develop into larger separate competitive communities. Now we come to the most important element in the narration, which is the Pillars of Heracles. To locate Atlantis we need first to locate the Pillars of Heracles. At Plato's time there were many places called the Pillars of Heracles, from the Phoenician coast to the Black Sea to Iberia, including Gibraltar. Even in some places in North Africa. Let us start with the name of Heracles first. Herodotus once said that Heracles is an Egyptian god. I quote. In fact, however, Heracles is a very ancient Egyptian god. And he suggested some gods' names like Shu, Khonsu and Arsaphes or Harsaphes. Heracles was worshipped at the now sunken city of Heraklion, where a large temple was constructed. Did he miss an Egyptian god's name that could be closer to the name Herakel? Yes, there is Herket, the ancient Egyptian name of the Sphinx. Herket, Herkel, close enough, isn't it? Heracles used to be depicted wearing lions' heads and skin, probably to look like the lion's body of the Sphinx. Sphinx or Herket's name is written on a stone slab called stele erected between his front paws. It is called the Dream Stele. It was carved by Thothmoses IV, who dreamt of the Sphinx asking him to remove the sand that accumulated over his body. He commemorated his dream on this stele. This is Herket name written on top of his head. Let us get the ancient Egyptian alphabet and see what was the Sphinx name in hieroglyphs. Well, let us find out. If we put the two symbols of Herket name together, it could be read Herkel. If we add the lion symbol which represents the letter L, and we can see that the two mounds carrying the sun between them look like the basket of the letter K, or double Q. It could easily read Herka. L. Now, the ancient Egyptians had another symbol, two raised arms, representing the living double or the stamina or the soul of a human being. The two raised arms used to take different shapes. Even the cow's horns of the goddess Hathor look like two raised arms. Even the Sphinx Herkel between the two pyramids looks like the sun between the two mounds, or, he has two raised arms. If the two raised arms of the Ka look like the two mounds, we could come up with the exact name, Herkel. We can add the letter S in hieroglyphs. It is the symbol of social status or privilege. And the meaning of the whole name will be Horus the double or the soul of the privileged lion. So, if Herkel is the Sphinx, what will be his pillars? None other than the three pyramids of Giza. Interestingly, when studying the origin of the Pillars of Heracles, Syriac scholars were aware of the pillars through their efforts to translate Greek scientific works into their language as well as into Arabic. The Syriac compendium of knowledge known as Kitaba Dalat Kal, Ellen, the cause of all causes, is unusual in asserting that there were three, not two, columns. And what about the name Atlantis? From where came the name Atlantis? It is derived from Atlas, right? So, what does Atlas have to do with Heracles, the Sphinx, and the pillars or the pyramids? According to Greek mythology, Atlas shares a legend with Heracles. He is depicted carrying a globe. Now we recall the scene of the Ka with the two raised arms, and the pyramids with the sun in between. Does it ring a bell? Can we see some similarities? And Atlas used to have 3 daughters called the Atlantides. Remember, it is images transferred from Egypt to the Levant to Greece. However, the legends change. And what will be the meaning of Atlas name written in hieroglyphs? Atlas name in hieroglyphs will be the A, means high, the T, means mound or growth, the L, the lion. A again. And finally the S, piece of clothes represents social status or privilege. Altogether will mean the high growth or mound of the lion of high social privilege.